Good afternoon, guests. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today to the Chau Chak Wing Museum. My name is Craig Barker. I'm the Head of Public Engagement for the museum. And I'd like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay our respects on behalf of the museum and the university more broadly to the traditional custodians of the lands, the airs and the sea, and acknowledge that ongoing cultural commitment from the Gadigal people to these areas. Of course, Saturday's International Museum Day, and it's wonderful to be able to welcome you today to an event which links in very nicely with the overall theme of International Museum Day this year as well. This is the first of 4 events throughout the year, which have been coordinated by our wonderful presenters this afternoon. So on behalf of the museum, thank you, Chiara, thank you, Anna, in all your spare time that you don't have. But we're in for a real treat this afternoon because over the series of the 4 talks, we're going to be examining the 1933 Carnegie Report on the Museums and Art Galleries of Australia, and to overview how the Australian museum sector has evolved, changed, learnt, not learnt in some cases, through those 9 decades. So as an overview for the project, as an overview for the report, and to also bring some of their own experiences in this first discussion, it is my great pleasure to welcome up to the podium Anna Lawrenson and Chiara O'Reilly. Neither of them need an introduction anyway, but esteemed colleagues from the University of Sydney's Museum Studies program, great friends of the Chau Chak Wing Museum. Who's going to go first? Anna. So please join me in welcoming Chiara and Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. And I too would like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal land, and to pay my respects to traditional custodians, past and present, and really, I guess, to reinforce that we make these sort of symbolic gestures of recognition, but one of the things that I'm always keen to think about is what we can actually do in practice. And so one of the things that Chiara and I have been looking at in terms of the Carnegie Report is some of the omissions, and thinking about the perspective of First Nations people within that report is almost entirely absent. So one of the areas that we've identified for a future lecture in this series is actually to look at what material changes have taken place over the intervening 90-odd years to address that omission and to actually look at more meaningful inclusion and recognition in a very practical sense. I'd also like to thank Craig for inviting us to present this paper. It's a real joy to be able to revisit some of our research that Chiara and I have been working on for a number of years. And so it's nice to kind of think about how our ideas have evolved over time. And also thanks to the Chau Chak Wing Museum for hosting us. All right, so the topic is the 1933 Carnegie Report. Fabulous quote. Lack of funds, lack of curatorship and lack of public interest was one of the great quotes that we took out of the report. I'd also, in my acknowledgements, like to recognise that we've had 2 excellent research assistants helping us on this project, Maria Karageorge and Hannah Newman, who've both contributed to the kind of richness of our presentation in different ways. So I want to thank them as well. All right, so in early January 1933, Sir Frank Sidney Markham, Secretary for the Museums Association in London, and Professor Henry Caselli Richards, a geologist from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, embarked on a 2-month-long study of museums and galleries across Australia. It was funded by the private philanthropic body, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and their report on museums and art galleries of Australia was the 5th in a series of surveys variously undertaken by the corporation to develop cultural institutions and promote cultural leadership throughout the British Empire. Interestingly, the Australian one was the first to actually incorporate an Australian author on that panel. So this was Richards alongside Markham from the UK. Now, in terms of the Carnegie Report in the history of Australian reports on museums and galleries in the sector, this report is relatively under-recognised. It's not so well studied as other more prominent reports like Museums in Australia from 1975, often referred to as the Pigott Report, which of course set the context for the National Museum of Australia in particular, but was broad-ranging. So the Markham and Richards report is relatively unknown. But significantly, it contains reflections on the state of the sector and recommendations for improving cultural activities, museum accessibility. Infrastructure was a huge focus of the report, and improvements in collection care, which foreshadow many contemporary challenges outlined in later reports. Much has been written on the Carnegie-sponsored loans exhibitions of the 1940s and 50s, or at least perhaps more. And this is indeed how Chiara and I arrived at it. We were looking at a history of blockbuster exhibitions in Australia, and this is where we kind of came across the Carnegie Report. But the extent to which Markham and Richards' report influenced such developments as the loans schemes has not necessarily been studied so thoroughly. So this brings us to how we arrived at it. These are some, we became aware of and indeed fascinated by the Carnegie Report in the process of research for our book on blockbuster exhibitions. These are some of our favourite cue shots from the book that we were able to reproduce. From the Art Gallery of New South Wales on the far side through to the National Gallery of Australia with the Masterpieces from Paris exhibition closest to me. So as part of that research, we came to realise how important both the report and the grant-based funding that the Carnegie Corporation provided both in the lead up to and the aftermath of that report, we came to realise just how important that was for the development of the sector. This made a huge contribution to the professionalisation of museums and the sector, the way it sought to engage with diverse publics, and in particular, the way it sought to engage with those publics in fulfilment of its educational mandate. From our point of view, the report provided an incredibly rich snapshot of the state of institutions in Australia. And importantly, it included regional areas, which is often something that is difficult to locate archivally. And this wasn't necessarily captured anywhere else in one single spot. In our current research, we've become really interested in the impact of the report, how its recommendations were implemented, and perhaps more importantly, what was omitted from the report, as I was sort of foreshadowing before. And so this was the kind of catalyst for this series of lectures, to think about how, you know, at approaching the 100-year anniversary of this report, how we seek to investigate its impact, consider its legacy, and the current state, look at the current state of museum practice in Australia today. So today we'll begin by outlining some of the context of the report, the research underpinning its investigation, and some of the key findings and its legacy. And it's a very tentative kind of journey into that area. All right, so Carnegie. Carnegie was a philanthropic trust based in New York, established to support the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding. They worked internationally as part of that support, and part of that support was devoted to the British Dominions and Colonies Fund. So in 1917, a small amount of funding was put aside for the support of activities in places such as Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. To give a sense of the scale of the investment, in the 10 years prior to 1938, the Carnegie Corporation made gifts to Australia to the value of more than £200,000, which is really considerable. In 1927, the Carnegie Corporation turned its attention towards Australia and commissioned a series of American so-called experts to report on the most fruitful ways in which the corporation might assist Australian knowledge and understanding. The first of these was former Dean of Teachers College at the University of Columbia, Dr. James E. Russell, whose suggestions led to the funding of an Australian Council for Educational Research. This was followed by L.D. Kaufman, who conducted inquiries on libraries and university administrations prior to the publication of their official report into the libraries in Australia and New Zealand by Ralph Munn that occurred in 1934. So, for example, here on campus, they were involved in resourcing the Teachers College when it first established here at the university as part of the kind of aftermath of that report into the libraries. So this gives a sense of the kind of vision of the corporation, the scope of their support, and signals their interest in the potential of museums and galleries to contribute to that educational mandate that they had set up. So in terms of the scope of the Museums and Galleries report, Markham's and Richards' study fits broadly within the Carnegie Corporation's aims from 1926 to 1938. 1938 was when the last of the inquiries into museums was conducted. So they set out to compare the progress of cultural institutions across the British Empire and its dominions. Prior to the Australian report, the corporation had commissioned inquiries on museums and galleries in Canada, Africa, the West Indies, and the Mediterranean, which included Malta, Cyprus, and Gibraltar. But, it was a very Eurocentric kind of perspective. So as Ian McShane has argued in his assessment of the white settler colonial politics, arguably underpinning much of the Carnegie Corporation's funding of local institutions in this period, Markham's and Richards' study succeeded in furthering those lines of international cooperation and knowledge transfer within the so-called English-speaking polity. So there was this kind of sense of empire and Eurocentrism that pervaded the funding, the kind of choice of funding, the geographical spread, etc. So what did Markham's and Richards do, the process? The report's authors based their findings on their personal journeys to museums. They were in Australia for 2 months and they visited all of these sites, which is just extraordinary. Chiara will cringe. One of my most memorable finds from our research into the Blockbuster book was about how difficult it was just to move throughout the country because of a lack of coordinated national rail network, for example. So they travelled around for 2 months and visited all of these museums. This involved obviously their observations, but they also had meetings with directors and curators who provided both quantitative data, so total income, salaries, maintenance of building expenditure, etc., but also the qualitative kind of feedback as well. And they consulted government accounts, etc. as well. Much as they called for a root and branch investigation, Markham and Richards' methodology was based on a fairly simple premise. Problems in the sector needed to be identified before any further changes could be made. And so this was the kind of broad aim. In terms of how many museums they surveyed, sources vary as to exactly how many. The authors likely expanded their survey from the initial 50 museums and galleries that were identified, kind of reported in newspapers at the time. And that's been a really interesting thing, I guess, is the amount of press attention that both the process of the report and then the grants subsequent received. So later reports claim they visited all but 2 of the 65 in total public museums in Australia. We know that at least 58 institutions were surveyed as part of the report. Within that, they identified 4 funding categories, which is sort of some of the interesting detail that Chiara and I are taking forward to think about, well, what does this mean for today? So those were government-funded organisations, which were 21, organisations funded by schools and colleges. The Macleay and the Nicholson Museum were both identified in the report. Cities or societies and universities or departments were their categories. Now, whilst their study was extensive, it wasn't comprehensive. Markham's and Richards omitted at least 7 museums because of their sheer geographical isolation. So the main area of museum concentration was the densely populated southeast corner of mainland Australia. This did comprise, however, of about 85% of total institutions. but it was not representative in particular of all of those provincial museums or regional museums. Practically, they arranged their report in terms of categories, so fine arts, applied arts, zoology, geology, mineralogy, paleontology, botany, anthropology, ethnology, history and technology. And again, thinking about how those categories are perhaps, you know, some of them are more or less important now in the sector than they were at that stage. In terms of significance, Markham and Richards' report was the first proper investigation into museums and galleries post-Federation. I think that's really key. And as you can see here, it was also conducted during the Great Depression, which kind of coloured some of the, particularly the funding context. It identified a sector in need of grants, in need of investment in exhibitions, one that really needed to make better use of loan exhibitions and exchanges, both from foreign collections, but also domestically as well. It identified a sector that needed desperate upgrades to facilities, and that wasn't necessarily exploiting the full educational opportunities that were both necessary to build the capacity of staff internally. So there was a big focus on professional development, but also that they weren't exploiting the full extent of educational opportunities for the public. There was also a sense that museums generally in Australia in the 21st century were a quiet backwater, severely lagging behind in progress in Britain, Europe and the United States. So the authors made repeated criticism of antiquated display methods, adhering to old 19th century practices, run-down, hazardous buildings and minimal budgets. Further, they lamented that the Australian museums had begun to enter the so-called last decrepit stage, as a generation of keen amateur scientists had vanished and given way to the motor and wireless enthusiasts. So therefore, there was a really kind of important turning point for cultural institutions where they were looking at, marking a need for greater professionalisation in the wake of changes to museum practice. And you can kind of see that in the quotes there. Okay, so in terms of the findings, what did they find? Several themes emerged from the Carnegie Report that were important in shaping the shaping of the museum sector. By far, the most important was the recognition that museums played a fundamental role in public education. For Markham and Richards, museums did not just serve the needs of students and researchers, but they were crucial spaces for the public as an audience, popular audiences. And that the public had different needs to those researchers or professionals. So the public demanded well-kept, attractive exhibits with clear labels, and they needed a kind of changing array of exhibitions. They needed to be fed. So thinking about the way that new technologies at the time, like dioramas and habitat cases, could be incorporated in displays to make them more dynamic. To move them beyond the antiquated rows and rows of jars and specimens that were certainly not a feature of modern public institutions, and I guess is partly encapsulated by this rather beautiful but perhaps quite traditional image you can see here. So quoting from the report, quoting from a report on the public museums of the British Isles published by the Carnegie Corporation Trust in 1928, they believed that the ideal curator was the foundation of inspiration, accessible to inquirers and his museum, an encouragement to all seekers of knowledge, and an educational centre for the town or the province. And so in that, you can kind of see this turn toward the opening up, the democratisation, as we might call it in contemporary parlance, of the institution, where the curator becomes not the carer of collections, but that point of contact between and facilitator between the public and the institution. So the need for museums to balance science, education and entertainment, and for curators to do more to engage and inspire a much wider audience was stressed at every turn and sort of informed many of the recommendations, from accessibility to infrastructure and collection care. Further, the need for curators to recognise the educational role of museums could not be clearer. So possibly if museums and art galleries were keener to impress the educational value of their activities on the public mind, the report said, a far better appreciation of cultural institutions would be noticed throughout Australia. So they kind of identified that museums and galleries weren't doing much to make themselves attractive to the public. Therefore, the public felt an apathy toward those institutions, and that this resulted in a lack of investment. And that idea of relevance and demonstrating relevance is obviously a key issue to this day. So part of the, I guess, the method of the report was to identify the strengths and weaknesses in the areas that they looked at. This gives you a kind of sense of the best features of each of the main centres. Darwin wasn't included. So you can see that emphasis on the technical staff and the professional capacity. They looked at the kind of extent and care of collections. Melbourne has the most extensive collection of Australian art. Sydney has an impressive technological museum, but they also identified those deficits. Labelling was a big factor, and particularly with that view of educating the public, looking at labels as a way to engage audiences. Poor facilities for professional staff, poor facilities for collection storage. Being understaffed and underfunded was a clear thread throughout the whole report. And as you can see there, Brisbane, with the lowest income of any similar sized town in the Empire, they kind of benchmarked it against other reports that they had done. So for Markham and Richards, they observed a lack of interest from local authorities in supporting museums and appreciating their potential value. They state it is indeed rare that councillors fall over themselves to get appointed to a museum committee. And the origin of this melancholy state of affairs is to be found often in the unfortunate impressions museums have made on them in their younger days. They had a great kind of emphasis on trying to engage children and to make those spaces, as I said, kind of open, accessible, interesting. And they made a direct connection between that and ongoing support for the sector, so that if those children have good experiences in their early days, they'll go on to want to be on the committee and to kind of advocate for those organisations, which again has real relevance to the way that we look at education in museums today. So acknowledging the educational role of museums had a systemic impact. The authors identified school children as an audience for whom museums needed to be more accessible. Museums, as they saw, were on the whole totally divorced from school curriculum, with few institutions cooperating with schools to organise visits and relate content to teachers in a kind of accessible form, so instructional leaflets, education packs, etc. Opportunities to link museum visits with relevant subjects, those curriculum links that are so important now, geography, local and natural history, for example, were also identified as an area where investment was needed. So as such, the authors identified only 3 or 4 museums that provided such educational services to schools, and this was seen as a real opportunity that they could be developing. In terms of leadership, administration and funding, overall, the Carnegie Report described a sector that was underfunded, lacking in national support, which was partly attributed to the legacy of Australia's still kind of disparate ex-colonies. So that impact of federating the states hadn't quite filtered through to a national kind of coordinated approach to both funding and supporting institutions. They also identified, as I said, this massive gap in professional development opportunities for curatorial staff and other staff. So the report states directors or curators of high standing exist. However, in only a dozen museums and half a dozen art galleries. All the rest, some 40 in number, have either part-time curators or honorary curators of varying ability and enthusiasm. And again, that kind of transition to the professionalisation is evident. They also noted that there was almost no communication or collaboration between institutions, cultural institutions, either domestically or internationally, and that there were minimal opportunities for curators to visit other museums to develop their networks and their skills. There was very little knowledge sharing. Another key finding was that funding was inadequate. This was in large part due to, as I said before, the kind of lack of demonstrating relevance and building that support outside of what was the academy. The report also notes that most of the museums in Australia were under government control, but that there was a lack of municipal assistance and interest. There were also different models of support observed. So in the larger states, for example, the state government in Victoria made direct grants to country museums, whereas in New South Wales, regional museums were controlled via the technological museums. So both of these systems were seen as inadequate, but it also demonstrates that lack of coordination and standardisation. Fluctuating budgets were also a significant issue. In terms of collections, they noted that the collections were good, were of world standard, but the facilities, or in some institutions, I should caveat, but that the facilities to house those collections and care for those collections were inadequate. Many collections were housed in incidental spaces that were entirely inappropriate for nationally significant collections. There were also observations made about the fire risks and hazards bound up in our institutions. Timber facilities and their termite risk, fire hazard were particularly flagged. Collection storage facilities were putting valuable, irreplaceable materials at risk. So in no other part of the empire it was observed are really valuable collections housed in such vulnerable buildings. And a fire in any one of the leading museums would mean the loss of absolutely irreplaceable specimens. In terms of exhibitions, their main kind of findings were that there were a lack of relevant and topical exhibitions. There was a kind of emphasis on this division between research collections and museums seeing themselves as research institutions versus exhibitions that were oriented to the public and being public spaces. They called for a real need to appeal to the public because the public are the ones that are funding institutions, and thus they need to be accessible, and they need to be understood, they need to be deemed relevant. And it strongly recommended providing more loan exhibitions from overseas sources, again, to ensure that there was that kind of turnover in content. It wasn't the same individual collection that was out on display all of the time. Now, it's worth noting that there is a lack of temporary exhibition spaces in museums at this time. They're not organised physically in the same way that we are used to today. So temporary exhibition spaces were a rarity. Artists such as Arthur Streeton noted, for example, that the Art Gallery of New South Wales had no space for temporary exhibitions. This was in 1936, I should say, meaning that temporary shows required the removal and storage of the permanent collections. Similarly, Adelaide and Melbourne lacked dedicated temporary exhibition spaces. In addition to simply not having the space to have that turnover of public exhibitions, there was also a lack of investment in making those spaces comfortable for the public. So electric lighting was minimal, climate control was non-existent. That has implications both for our visitors but also our objects. Indeed, the first climate-controlled exhibition space in an art gallery opened in 1962 with a small extension of the then National Gallery of South Australia in Adelaide. So all of these kind of factors meant that, you know, we talk about museums sometimes being perceived as static kind of storage houses. This was the picture that the Carnegie Report presented. They also suggested that loaning of collections was encouraged to fill gaps in Australian collections, but also to encourage that more dynamic display through temporary exhibitions that could excite the interest of visitors. Now, in terms of audience, all of their kind of recommendations about the public spaces of the institutions was pushing toward a greater recognition of the value of visitors within those spaces. So they noted that displays were not designed for the broad public, that emphasis needed to be placed on engaging that public, particularly children, and as I said, in part so that they had that appreciation of institutions growing up. Suggestions were included for reaching out to schools, sending collections out to schools, and the need for not just engaging with school audiences, but for greater publicity generally. So actually engaging the community and communicating about what it is that they were doing. Now, despite these areas for improvement, there were some positives observed as well. There's a lovely quote: "One of the pleasantest sights in Australia is to see the Melbourne Museum and Art Gallery on a Sunday afternoon, the thousands of residents touring its many halls and galleries, parents with children, young men and old men, girls and grandmothers, all seem to regard a visit to these excellent galleries as the ideal way of spending the afternoon." Now, from that, you can see the kind of value that they placed in trying to make a comfortable and amenable space for the public. And that really underpinned their recommendations. So overall, the report provided a roadmap for moving into a more visitor-focused, professional and visible museum sector. And I shall now turn over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Anna. Done a fabulous job at setting things up. So in thinking about the legacy of this report, I'll pull out the similar themes that Anna's kind of identified and give you the kind of moving forward, the implications for some of the investment. So in the wake of its report, the Carnegie Corporation actually stepped in and provided support for the sector, which helped to bring museum professionals from other countries to Australia. It also looked to foster professional groups such as the Association of Art Galleries and Museums, and it actually provided funding that led to the establishment of the first conference for this organisation, and provided grants that supported development and exchanges, and also bursaries for people to go to those conferences. And I think that this is a really important investment in developing early networks for Australian institutions. As Anna mentioned, there was almost no collaboration or discussions between cultural institutions at this time, and that the Carnegie Corporation investment actually helped to put in place some of those first steps. They facilitated travel for curators and other museum staff to travel both within Australia and also outside of Australia. They provided grants that were about improving facilities and also developing resources and opportunities to really focus on visitor engagement. Things like marketing was something that Carnegie Corporation really invested in. They also did a lot of work, and I suppose the report, an important legacy from the report, was the contribution it made to valuing and better understanding the wealth of Australian collections, which the report recognised as really outstanding, particularly, of course, in natural history and such like. So as part of the report, there are various recommendations and there are various bits of investment that result in physically improving collection infrastructure. So whether that was in relation to storage facilities, they did even elect to sponsor the construction of cases to preserve collection items over other aspects because of the value of those collection items. You can see here an article from not long after the Carnegie Report talking about support for investment in cultural exhibition spaces in the city of Newcastle. There were changes, I suppose, that we can see as part of the legacy post the Carnegie Report that really focused investment in how collections were utilised, and the kind of shift in the understanding of those collections. So we've got two wonderful images here. The bottom one is an image, of course, of the Timber Court from the then Technological Museum in 1908. And you've got that amazing massing of the collection as a tool for demonstration for learning about the technical properties of wood and the sort of specimens that were available for workers in the furniture and all sorts of other uses of wood. And Anna and I are comparing it here to the kind of shift that we can trace from that period up to all the way up to today, where temporary exhibition spaces and the way that that same collection, those very same items, are then repositioned and re-seen in a different environment. I think this is part of the, the changes in museums in those 90 years post the report, but it really shows a very different idea about the relationship between collections and displays, where we have this emphasis on bringing out smaller selections from the collection storage areas, either in temporary or permanent displays. And I think that, the powerhouse, the eucalyptusum, which some of you might remember, that was so interesting because it was almost bringing out some of these items from the powerhouse collection as a sort of historical relic of the institution's own history and development. There were also, and particularly one of the sort of threads that we've followed through in our interest in this report is a thread around the Australian Museum. And it's interesting that they also did an enormous amount of work post the report to redesign their collection displays, very much thinking about visitor experience. And so that's something that I think is useful to think about and kind of trace along these gorgeous images of the Long Gallery in the Australian Museum, and thinking about how this space transformed over time. So exhibits in the gallery was noted in 1934. So just after the report, there was a great effort across the Australian Museum to rearrange the gallery displays. They rearranged the entire shell display, which sounds terrifying to me, but there's huge investment in rearranging the gallery displays to make them more attractive and more useful to students was the other aspect that they really stressed. The study collections were also being brought up to date, and there was a coordinated investment in that. Now, Anna may have mentioned the federated rail and how challenging that was, but the other thing that is a real thread in the Carnegie Report is the lack of electric lighting, which isn't something that you tend to think about, but this was a major investment that happened just after the Carnegie Corporation, where there was works carried out at the Australian Museum to improve the lighting of the collections and the displays. So that these transformed it. These sequence of shots of the same room and showing its history and showing its change, you can see that just after the Carnegie Report, there, the change is the space that's given over to visitors, the accommodations that is made through seating in a space, which is a major shift in museums, but also then the way that then we have a sort of a much clearer space with the idea of much larger groups coming through in the contemporary display. So one of the things that is particularly interesting for the Australian Museum is that the investment from the Carnegie Corporation, one of the steps that they took was to send to Australia experts who came and stayed for a great deal of time. So Frank Toes came out from the California Academy of Sciences and actually spent 8 months traveling across Australia, training taxidermy and preparation departments across the country. And this resulted in the implementation of diorama displays in some of our museums. So the Australian Museum, you might know, has the oldest extant diorama in the country, which is from 1927, which is a diorama of Lord Howe Island, which is just in this Long Gallery. It was restored as part of this redevelopment of the Long Gallery. But in 1937, so not long after the Carnegie Report, they sent out Frank Toesey, and he worked with a bunch of taxidermies and preparators at the Australian Museum and artists. They went out to Brewarrina to collect specimens, and they came back and constructed a series of dioramas in a kind of rapid investment of time and improvements. And this is an example of that from 1937. The Kangaroo Group which I think is really quite extraordinary. And one of the things that I think is so important about the way that this was seen at the time, and thinking about the importance that the Carnegie Corporation wanted to imbue in the museums, was that these dioramas were very much about trying to improve public understanding about the natural flora and fauna of Australia, and particularly were focused on ideas around conservation, which I think is, that is a theme that continues to this day to be incredibly important. They did a series of these dioramas and they are astoundingly beautiful, and Tozy trained staff throughout the country in workshops where they conducted similar rapid constructions of dioramas. The other big thread that I think is so important is the sorts of changes that happen around audience, and the need to engage and really target audience as the key users of cultural institutions, and to make sure that we make them attractive. So in 1937, there's an article in the West Australian that talks about how there is much that remains to be done to make the halls and exhibitions of museums more attractive and of greater value to the public. In addition to attracting people, the museum authorities should use every means of taking the museum to the people. And these are examples of that very trait. They're later, but this notion of moving collections around, making them accessible, is something that is instituted following the Carnegie Report, where there is a lot of exchange from the state galleries with regional galleries and moving works. This then becomes a very important thread through the 20th century. The art gallery bus from the 1950s, that was actually taken around the country by a man who went on to become a very eminent art historian, Bernard Smith. And he would drive the bus and take it out to country towns. And it is this wonderful exchange that happens through that process. The other example that we have there is the Australian Museum, which launches a train in 1978. It's actually fitted out in Everleigh, just the other side of Redfern. They had 2 carriages, and their aim was for it to be taken to country towns throughout New South Wales, and they would be able to access and share the collection and information with roughly 50,000 visitors a year. This is one of those first trips out. And so you can see in the top image, you've got the exhibition train carriage, which was set up as a permanent travelling exhibition. And then the bottom carriage was the second carriage, and that was the educational space. And this train, Craig, you'll be amazed, travelled with 2 dedicated education officers who took groups. And I think, these pictures, I'm sure that they are very much indicative of the kind of enthusiasm for rural, to kids to get into those spaces to learn. Look, the workbooks are out, they've got pencils in their mouth in the top one, and you have never seen a more engaged bunch of little hands shooting up for questions. But I think it's really important to think about, kind of in the wake of the Carnegie Report, that there was a sort of twofold investment in audiences, which was very much about maximising the educational outreach potential of museums. And secondly, that the second aspect was really about making the space itself much more engaging and comfortable for visitors. So the things that happened at the Australian Museum that really they just joined the dots from the Carnegie Report. In 1935, they invested in greater publicity. One of the first things they did was they erected a public notice board that was erected in the museum grounds on the corner of College and William Street, and that was floodlit for night display. And they put up posters about what was on at the Australian Museum. They also published leaflets. They had lunchtime lectures, which is a little bit of an echo of today, that were implemented, and they were about increasing attendance. They were also about sharing knowledge. And that in a few years after these what we consider quite basic steps, the visitation quadrupled for the Australian Museum. So they were really able to document those very straightforward changes. There was also another strain that they really invested in, was that they invested in collaborating with the education department. And again, I'm looking at the Australian Museum. So the Australian Museum launched a school magazine that was aimed at children and encouraged them to learn about the museum and natural history and such like. And at the same time, they also produced a supplement to the Department of Education's Educational Gazette, which was aimed at teachers and therefore facilitated educational access. Similarly, at the Australian Museum, tertiary students were also engaged. So the Sydney Technical College, which was or is still just behind the Australian Museum, they collaborated with the Technical College, and art students produced a large number of posters that depicted museum subjects, and these were ways of publicising the museum. And again, this seems like a really straightforward step, but it was incredibly novel at the time to promote. The Carnegie Report actually has a section in there where they talk about how some directors actually seem reticent to promote their institution at all. So it marked a massive change. The Australian Museum also received a Carnegie grant that allowed them to develop a whole series and a whole suite of educational resources that they then worked on with the Department of Education. There were then those staff exchanges. So one of the taxidermists who worked with Tozy was then able to go to the United States and travel through American museums and learn more about techniques there. How am I going for time? 10 minutes, okay. Other things, and I know the Australian Museum still does these, but there were a number of school collections were prepared and they were forwarded out to schools. So the Lending Box program, which some of you might know, was something that is important within this. They also developed and really started to prioritise some of their teaching specimens, and especially looking at making sure that they had instructive labels, and that there was often illustrated labels as well. So moving away particularly from the Latin, which had been so dominant within historic collections. So after that extraordinary run through and so many beautiful images, it's my job to think about where this takes us and where we want to take this, because all of this really leads us to a point where we start to think about this series, where Anna and I are very interested in what is the state of the sector today and really reflecting on some of the changes in practice and really taking a lead from some of the very significant admissions that are in the report. So the gender issue is an important one that is not addressed in this report. There's a declaration in here that the most important thing you could do is to employ a good man to be the curator for these institutions. So gender and diversity is something that Anna and I are keen to explore across the topics that we'll be addressing in further sessions. Inclusion is a very important aspect which is not discussed in this document at all, as we can imagine, but is a real priority across the sector in thinking about how we make our spaces and also our organisations more inclusive. Another aspect that is very interesting for the sort of work that Anna and I have done on blockbusters, there in this report, there's no mention of museums and their relationship to tourism. These museums are seen as engaging with their local community, whereas we all know now that the shift has seen museums become increasingly positioned as cultural facilities that are economic drivers for visitors and destination travel. So that's something. And that these are all topics that we're keen to kind of unpack in future sessions. So thank you ever so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Anna and Chiara. That was wonderful, actually, and I've learned a lot personally, and I want to train. Yes. We'll send out notification about the forthcoming presentations in the series very soon, but we've got a couple of minutes if there are any questions from the floor. Because we are recording this, I'm going to bring around the microphone is the only thing, but if you guys are okay for that, we've got...
It's in part an observation. Bernice Murphy is my name. One of the difficulties about the report is that it doesn't give you any sense of the physical disposition of museums as different institutions in the capital cities. For example, Melbourne, I mean, you read out that description of what a wonderful experience it was to visit the art galleries and the museum on a Sunday. That came from the fact that the gallery is founded in 1861 and with the museum and with the library. So another important thing is trusteeship is invested in Melbourne across 3 institutions by one board. So different in Sydney. By the way, in Sydney, there was a plan drawn up under the government by architect Barnett for there to be a gallery inside the museum. It's on one of the early plans, and that didn't happen. So a huge difference between Sydney and Melbourne is the disposition of institutions and the fact that in Sydney, so much is configured of all the history right up to today by the fact that you have a different technological museum, science museum, and the art gallery in the 1870s coming out of an art society. Also in Melbourne is a huge patronage factor that hasn't come out. The Felton bequest not mentioned, astonishing acquisitions, giving the experience of going to the National Gallery's collection an extraordinary expansion. So I just think that it's not a critique of what you're saying, it's just to point out how important it is to realize what the Carnegie Report does not describe, which is essential to understanding the histories of the institutions today. I could say so much more, but that's enough.
Yeah, no, Bernice, thank you so much. We have so much more to say on the Carnegie Report, and that there is that state division, there's divisions within cities. I mean, so much of our institutions are still wrestling with the legacy of their foundations and the disparities between them. We didn't have time to talk about patronage, but that is something that's covered in the different funding models across the different institutions. And I think that kind of the context of that remains a major issue today. Yeah.
And I guess that's something that in putting together this paper, that's something that we were reminded of the research that we did for the book, because we discovered, embarrassingly, a crazy spreadsheet that we had drawn up, which charted precisely those things. When these institutions were established, how they were established. So whether it was an art society that then transitioned, had to go through that process of professionalization, or if it was something set up as a public organization from the beginning. And I think it's that texture, you rightly point out, that colors both what they can do then, but still has such an impact on how they interface with the public now. That's kind of that's what I get really excited about, is how the history of these organizations actually really still informs how they communicate with audiences. So I think, thank you for raising that, because you're absolutely right.
Thank you, Anna and Chiara. Amazing paper on the report. My question is really simple. Is that a follow-up report after that report? Because from the legacy that you really draw on the case studies of Australian Museum, we thought with such an important report, the government would probably take some action instead of just, it sounds like only the individual institution who might have the funding, who could sort of add on some of the sort of, feedback from that report. So thank you.
So I think in terms of the response, what we see documented is the continuing Carnegie grants. They dry up in the 40s.
Yep.
In the war in particular obviously disrupts that. There is a kind of shift in priority. The next major report. So one of the things we've done in our research is to compare the Carnegie Report to the next big national one, which is the 1975 Pigott Report. And then we've compared it to the 2019, I can't remember, it's Museums for All, or I can't remember the name of it. It was the 2019 report, which was about, but it was only about national institutions in Canberra.
Yeah.
So very kind of narrow remit. But we have looked at those 3 reports and kind of compared the recommendations across them to try and track how those, if changes were implemented, how they were supported by government, etc. There's been a call across all of those for a national coordinated approach to the funding of cultural institutions. As you know, has kind of not happened. You know, disappointingly, we're the day after budget and we can't announce some big national initiative that's going to support our cultural institutions. So that's something that is across all of them, but still a deficit.
Yeah, I think the thing that's so interesting in the Australian context is those state divisions and the way that, you know, various governments at the state level may pick things up and do things post the Carnegie Report, but they also have the Great Depression and then the Second World War. So like the Pigott Report, which gets sort of lost in a moment in Australian history, this also gets lost in a kind of context where there are so many other things that are going on. Still change happens, but the nice things are that kind of collective discussions, I guess, in the community that starts to develop as a result of their investment.
Yeah, and the Commonwealth support for exhibitions, I mean, that's foreshadowed in the report, and that's something that we see emerge from that National Gallery Victoria exhibition queue that I showed you at the very beginning. So the Commonwealth support of international exhibitions was an outcome, I guess, you know, whether it was directly influenced by the Carnegie, but it is something that we see happen. But then we also see that dissipate as states become competitive in between themselves, so that there's no longer exhibitions necessarily that come out and tour all around because you want the money to stay in New South Wales if the show comes to New South Wales.
Thank you both. Can't wait for part 2. Yes, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We hope to see you at a future Chau Chak Wing Museum event. But can you join me in thanking Chiara and Anna one more time?